Well, we need to go on to our next topic, which is talking about what our county council is doing. And even though the headlines have been dominated by national politics for most of this past year, the Montgomery County Council hasn't been in a COVID cave. They've been very active these days and have several initiatives that our audience should be aware of. One of which is the council is holding hearings on with something called the Housing Justice Act, which would prevent landlords from raising rents in certain circumstances, but would also prevent inquiries regarding criminal histories on rental housing applications. And specifically, a landlord would not be able to inquire into whether the applicant has been arrested for, among other things, indecent exposure, public urination, and disturbance of the peace. Now, admittedly, those are misdemeanors, but the fact is that that might indicate that this is not a person that you want living in your housing community. So, Mark, what do you think of this bill?
Well, let's be clear who suffers as a result of landlords not being able to screen tenants. It's the other tenants, it's the neighbors, it's those who have to deal with the antisocial behavior of people who could have been, should have been, might have been identified at the outset as having a history, who end up getting let into a building. I think anybody who's lived in a multiple dwelling has kind of had an experience with, less than hospitable neighbors. And again, if there's criminal history, if there's an opportunity to identify somebody who's potentially a problem based on past behavior, then landlords should be able to do that screening.
Again, though, if this happened 10 years ago, I mean, is a maturation process with people. I think it's kind of a slippery slope if you're talking about minor, these misdemeanors. I think that there is a limit, perhaps time range, 3 years or less or something.
If they're engaged in decent exposure, don't you think that suggests that there's a more serious problem than just that minor event? I mean,
but let's say it happened when he was 15, 12 years ago. I think that
there wouldn't be any record if it was 15, right?
I don't know.
There'd be
the bill also prohibits any information from a juvenile history level. Right. So we're not talking about juveniles. We're talking about adults. And if they have a history of indecent exposure, that shows whether or not they're on the sexual identification list. That shows that there's a problem there.
Well, you're saying a history again on these. If there's one incident,
That's part of when you pull up your criminal history record. If you have one incident that shows up, it's called a history.
But Susan, landlords have discretion. In other words, you're saying that, there's an incident 10 years ago, the landlord has discretion. If they have a property where there's perhaps a history of antisocial, they may take a harder line. If it's a building that doesn't have a problem, they may not. So there's nothing that requires the landlord to use this information. They have it as a tool to protect individual properties.
Well,
and it could be some form of discrimination.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time on this segment, and I'm not going to be able to ask Sam about the Silver Spring Business Development Improvement District. So we'll have to hold that over for some later date. When we come back from this short break, President Donald Trump is impeached for the second time in his term. What's going to happen next? Stay tuned.